The individual is but an atom. He is born, he acts, he dies. But principles are eternal.
In this entry, I will be doing something different. It is not an argument, but a description, and a short, inconclusive essay on the American identity. This is the 10,000. If you like this video, please like and subscribe to support the channel. The long 19th century is a term used by historians to describe the time between the French Revolution in 1789 and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. It is largely defined by both industrialization and the formation of nations. Because of this, it has been probably the most defining period of human history except for the agricultural revolution. The effects that have been brought about by the 19th century industrialization and science have been so great it might be too early to even know the extent of its effects. The nation, likewise, has been just as important. To describe a nation is hard. It means slightly different things to different people. Nominally, it is a group of people that share the same culture, customs, and therefore similar group outlook on life. It is thus a bit of a lie and a hell of a generalization. Nevertheless, it does exist in reality to a certain extent. With nations come common ideas, especially common ideas of governance that the nation mostly agrees on because of a shared history. For instance, America and France both have a long, proud tradition of state secularism, but both countries practice it differently. America has the separation of church and state. The state cannot make laws governing religion. Americans have freedom of religion. France's secularism is different. It is called laïcité, which means freedom from religion. In the United States, banning the burqa, yarmulke, or shawl is considered tyrannical, while in France it is considered liberation. These cultural differences and national attitudes were especially real to those who helped build the nations in the 19th century. As Napoleon's army marched across Europe, they brought with them their food, water, guns, and ammunition. They also brought with them something far more powerful, an idea whose time has come, the idea of the revolution, the idea of the nation. The march of their ideas and revolutions across to Europe and the Mediterranean sowed the seeds of national consciousness throughout the peoples of Europe. As Napoleon progressed, so too did the want for a nation from the nationally dispossessed. Poles that fought for Napoleon wished to reinstate their nation on the map, and Germans, for the first time, dreamed of a German nation that they could collectively make laws that represented their own cultures and customs. Throughout the 125 years, by politics, economics, and timing, the nations of Europe sprouted. By the 1920s, there was a plethora of nations in Europe, each with their own sovereign states. Greece, Albania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Ireland, Germany, and Italy each have their own nation-states. These nations were important to people who died to bring them about, as much as my nation is important to me. I've lived on multiple continents, all of which people had their opinions on the American Republic. It is when I was living in those places, reading and thinking, that gave me a better understanding of the world, what it is, my place in it, and my own culture. The concept of culture today is often disregarded and relegated solely to the discussion of food, dress, and anesthetization. Everywhere in the world, American culture is represented by a McDonald's restaurant, blue jeans, or a pint of Bud Light. That is a trivial understanding of culture generated by a globalized world. In a globalized world, we are often told a lie, that we live in an enlightened age. It is a lie that is propagated throughout many periods of history, often before disastrous epochs. In truth, we are no better than what we used to be. We have not discovered some hidden scheme in religion or economics that will transform our society into some enlightened and peaceful period of time. We live perpetually in the days of Abraham. The only thing that will ever protect us is strength. That strength is embedded into each of us by the wisdom of our culture. I will now explain to you the meaning of American identity and strength. Most history books that tell a grand history of the United States begins in the same place, not with Jamestown's, the Conquistadors, Columbus, or even Roanoke, but with the Magna Carta. Magna Carta Libertatum, the Great Charter of Freedoms, is a document that has been interpreted in many ways throughout the centuries. Signed in 1215, the Magna Carta was a constitutional charter that proclaimed that the barons in England had certain privileges that could not be encroached upon by the King of England. In essence, it proclaimed that the king had limits on his power. The implications of this document have been numerous throughout history. However, it ultimately has been interpreted and revised to mean that the Magna Carta gave a precedent for an individual's liberty over the state. The ideals represented in the Magna Carta became the core to the British culture, and that core asserted that the state was a mechanism to protect the individual. This differed from so many other cultural traditions on Earth, where the individual was expendable for, or at least not as valuable as, the greater community. The state had limits to its power, and individuals had certain inalienable rights. The philosophy of placing the individual over the state is called liberalism, and it is with the Magna Carta that British liberalism was proclaimed. However, this liberalism in British culture was not solely proclaimed by the Magna Carta and its interpretations. No document can forge history. There needs to be customs and culture that go along with it. And lucky for the Magna Carta, British culture was a culture that valued the individual. Historians have even interpreted that the Magna Carta itself was not a revolutionary document, but a document that recovered rights from the Norman kings and reasserted folk customary laws that came from the Anglo-Saxons and Celts. The American legal tradition is based on the Magna Carta and that folk common law that was practiced thousands of years ago on islands 3,500 miles from the eastern seaboard. The rights of an American are therefore seen as primordial, given to them since the beginning and only reclaimed and defended through the state. All Americans, therefore, have their roots in England, whether or not they or their ancestors came from the British Isles, and accordingly are granted their ancient rights as Englishmen. This is seen most famously in the Constitution of the United States. An heir to the Magna Carta and influenced by liberal and Enlightenment thought, the American Constitution codified those freedoms in 1787 for the new American Republic that won a war of independence. The War of Independence is sometimes proclaimed by many patriotic Americans as philosophically groundbreaking. It was not. The Revolutionary War was not so much of a revolution as was the French or Bolshevik revolutions, but a reclamation and a conservative revolt. The American Revolution was not a radical breaking with the past, but a fight that asserted that, in a new era, Americans had the same liberties that they always had, the liberties of the Englishman, the liberties over the state. Many do not see the importance of history to American culture, and it has been a common mistake that they claim the Republic was built solely on documents and Enlightenment philosophy. It is because of this mistake that British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher once proclaimed, "America is a nation built on philosophy, while the nations of Europe are built on history." It is an idea that many have loved, but do so wrongly. The culture or nation cannot be based solely on a document, just as philosophy cannot be made outside the bounds of its time and place. Documents with no greater backing will eventually be disregarded, just as philosophy that is not made in the spirit of the age is disregarded. The journey of American identity that began with the Magna Carta did not end with the liberal philosophy or the Constitution or the hundreds of influential pamphlets and essays written by philosophers such as Montesquieu, Locke, or Paine. Nor can a single document encapsulate the individualism an American possesses. Any identity and culture are formed through a continual process. It is formed through history, and American history is loud, boisterous, and chaotic. The American is an individual because he made himself. British liberalism gives the basis for American culture, but it is not the whole story, or else the American is nothing more than a Brit. The rest revolves on a process of becoming an American. This process is a three-part procedure taken by the individual: rejection, struggle, and providence. The rejection is the rejection of the former culture and self. The struggle is the act of working, fighting, and building, and providence is the prize one attains through that struggle. The formation of American identity throughout history begins with the rejection of the old culture. In order to be an American in a certain sense, one must have a former identity and break with it. The draw to leave one's old culture and become an American has been a strong one since the initial European colonization on the American continent. In his philosophy of history, written in the early 19th century, the philosopher Hegel describes his lore by stating America, therefore, is the land of the future, where, in ages that lie before us, the burden of the world's history shall reveal itself. It is a land of desire for all those who weary of the historical lumber room of old Europe. The United States is a nation of immigrants because it is a nation of individuals rejecting their former identity. The vast majority of people who moved to America were poor. They were peasants in one land, were sold as slaves, sold themselves as slaves, wanted to make their own business without a dictatorial bureaucracy, wanted to own property at all, etc. They were the poor and they had no choice at life in their current place, so they decided to move to a new one. Where the old culture provided destitution and subjugation, America provided purpose. That purpose, however, was attained with the next step, the struggle. The United States was a frontier country that was eventually spread across a continent, mostly devoid of people. It was the frontier and its promise and struggles that shaped the American identity. Before the European arrival, North America could not be settled as a single entity without industrialized transportation technology, and the people already settled in North America were mostly wiped out due to Eurasian diseases. This vast, mostly empty continent gave new Americans incredible room to grow, but required a fight with nature. Americans had to cross vast distances, contend with dangerous animals, and create a self-sustaining farm out of the wild. Through this struggle, the individual is transformed. He no longer has any semblance of what he once was because the rules and culture of his past gave him no respite or help with his current situation. He is alone, and because he is alone, he found providence. He owes nothing to a community who did not help him tame a wild land, nothing to a tribe who did not build him a house, and he owes little to Washington as all it did was allow him to settle. He builds a business himself, he forges an industry himself, and he discovers science himself. The American achieves the dream. He owes nothing to anyone except himself. He sustains himself. He found providence, and his prize is being an individual. With this individualism, the American realizes where his duty lies. The American builds a house because he owes it to himself to live in a house. He builds a nation and settles the frontier, not because he cares about the policy in Washington, but because it is his right to find providence in the frontier. He pays his taxes because he is a citizen, and he owes it to himself to be a good citizen. He builds a community and raises a family, not because of some promulgation of a tribe, but because it is what a man does. The American duty is to himself. It is the fulfillment of liberalism. The American is born with the British liberal tradition, but it is not just his ideals. He lives with the tradition by breaking with the old, finding a frontier to settle, and struggling with nature. In the end, the American becomes the ideal liberal, the radical individual. He rules himself.